October 27, 1969, Quang Duc Province, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. A 21-year-old captain arrived to take command of a hilltop firebase for the first time in his life. He walked the perimeter with his sergeant. What they found were soldiers playing volleyball. The firebase had been open for 5 weeks. The wire was sparse. Fields of fire were uncleared. The gun pits were shallow. No one had built fighting positions because no one had shot at them yet. They were a minor target, tucked between the jungle and the Cambodian border. Nobody was coming. The next morning, approximately 6,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars crossed that border and attacked. 27 American soldiers, 156 Montagnard fighters, one hilltop the size of a football field, they held for 5 days. What the NVA had not calculated in all their reconnaissance and all their planning was the man they had handed his first command the day before the assault began. The Central Highlands of South Vietnam in 1969 was a corridor, not a battlefield. The Ho Chi Minh Trail did not end at the Vietnamese border. It funneled men, weapons, and materiel from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia and into the highland interior of the South, a system of roads, caches, and staging areas that no amount of American bombing had succeeded in severing. Cutting those approach routes was the job of the Special Forces Camp Network, a chain of fortified outposts manned by Green Beret A-teams and their civilian irregular defense group fighters, mostly Montagnard tribesmen who had lived in these mountains for generations and who, in many cases, had more reason to fight the North Vietnamese than any soldier on either side of the American political debate about the war. By mid-1969, the NVA's 1st Division, built around the 28th, 32nd, and 66th Infantry Regiments and supported by the 40th Artillery Regiment, had moved down from Laos into Base Area 740, the Cambodian sanctuary west of Bu Prang. The same 66th Regiment had fought Americans at Ben Het earlier that year, pressing a 55-day siege before being forced back across the border. It had not been defeated. It had been repositioned. Its new objective was the corridor between the Cambodian border and the highland city of Ban Me Thuot. Take out the artillery firebase network covering Bu Prang, open the infiltration lanes, push toward Ban Me Thuot, and cut South Vietnam in half at its narrowest point. Firebase Kate had been established in September 1969 specifically to deny them that corridor. It sat on a hilltop in Quang Duc Province, roughly 1 kilometer from the Cambodian border, positioned to put artillery fire on approach routes that ran directly toward the Special Forces camp at Bu Prang. 3 guns, one 105mm howitzer and 2 155mm howitzers, crewed by artillerymen from the 5th Battalion, 22nd Field Artillery, and the 1st Battalion, 92nd Field Artillery. The artillery crews numbered 27 men. The Montagnard fighters of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, drawn from Special Forces detachments, a 233 and a 236, numbered approximately 156. Total garrison, fewer than 200 men. Kate was one of 3 small fire bases in the area, alongside Firebase Annie and Firebase Martha, meant to provide overlapping artillery coverage. The system only worked if the bases could communicate, resupply, and reinforce each other. In the fall of 1969, none of those things were guaranteed. This was the year of Vietnamization. President Nixon had announced the policy in June. American combat units would be drawn down, and responsibility for the war's conduct would be progressively transferred to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. For the ARVN, the policy came with resources and advisors. For American commanders already in the field, it came with a more immediate consequence. The answer to requests for reinforcement was increasingly no. The Americans were leaving. The ARVN were inheriting, and in the gap between those two facts, there were men on hilltops hoping the transition happened somewhere else first. The NVA watched all of it. They had been watching since before Ben Heat. Sergeant Daniel Piarelli, a weapons specialist and Special Forces advisor from Detachment A-236 at Bu Prang, arrived at Firebase Kate on October 27, 1969. What he found caught him off guard. Kate had not yet been attacked, so its garrison had not yet organized itself to be defended. Men were playing volleyball. Defensive positions that should have taken weeks to construct had not been started. The wire was thin. The gun pits offered no protection against direct fire. Nobody expected a regiment. Captain William Albrecht arrived the next morning, October 28th. He was 21 years old. He was the youngest captain in the 5th Special Forces Group. This was his first combat assignment. Firebase Kate was his first command. He and Piarelli walked the perimeter together and reached the same conclusion simultaneously. If a regiment was out there, and the intelligence indicators suggested there was, Kate was not ready. They began issuing orders for defensive improvements and increased patrols. At approximately 2300 hours that night, one of those patrols found the forward elements of an NVA regiment in the jungle below the hill. They had not been wrong about the regiment, they had only been wrong about the timing. The night of October 28th passed in tension. Patrols exchanged fire with NVA elements, probing the perimeter. By dawn, the base was in heightened alert. Albrecht and Piarelli used the night to finish what defensive improvements they could. They moved ammunition. They positioned men. They called for air support assets to be on standby. At approximately 11:30 on the morning of October 29th, the first ground assault hit. NVA troops came from multiple directions with small arms, mortars, B-40 rockets, and artillery fire. The assault was not a probe. It was a coordinated regimental attack, the kind the 66th Regiment had rehearsed at Ben Haight, the kind that relied on mass and surprise to overwhelm a position before air support could arrive. The defenders of Kate met it with everything they had. The howitzers fired at direct fire range. The Montagnard riflemen held their positions. The assault was repelled. Then the guns started again. This was the pattern the NVA used across the Central Highlands in 1969. Sustained bombardment to exhaust defenders and suppress air operations, assault at dawn and dusk. The precise windows when spooky gunships had to arrive and depart, leaving gaps in air cover, and continuous pressure designed to grind a garrison down until its ammunition and will were spent. It had broken camps before. It had worked at Firebase Gold in 1966. It had forced the evacuation of Firebase Helen, a sister base to Kate, in the same operation just days earlier. On October 25th, a multi-battalion NVA force had shelled Helen with mortars, recoilless rifles, and 122 mm rockets until its garrison was relocated to Duke Lap. Kate was next, but Kate had something Helen had not. It had Albrecht. On October 29th, as Albrecht stood exposed in the open directing a medevac helicopter through enemy fire toward the Firebase's wounded, rocket shrapnel tore into his arm. The wound was serious enough that the medevac crew offered to take him out with the casualties. He refused. He sent the helicopter out with the wounded men and returned to the perimeter. He would not leave Kate until his men did. Over the following days, the NVA maintained continuous pressure. They fired from positions inside Cambodia where American aircraft could not pursue them. They attacked with ground assaults that intensified at dusk and probed through the night. Air Force Captain L. Dykes, the navigator aboard the Spooky, AC-47 gunship flying call sign Spooky 41, told Albrecht during a radio transmission that Kate was receiving more enemy fire than any other American outpost in South Vietnam at that moment. Albrecht later recalled that this was not exactly what he wanted to hear. During the nights, the Spooky gunships were the difference between Kate surviving and Kate being overrun. The AC-47, with its three 7.62 millimeter miniguns capable of 300 rounds per second, circled the hilltop in continuous left bank orbits, turning the jungle perimeter into a kill zone. NVA forces had learned at other firebases not to attempt massed assaults while Spooky was overhead. At Kate, they concentrated their fire instead on the transition windows, the minutes when one gunship was departing and the next had not yet arrived. In those gaps, they pushed forward. Albrecht spent those gaps moving along the perimeter, redistributing ammunition, pulling casualties out of exposed positions, and returning fire himself. Air Force F-100s, F-4 Phantoms, and A-1E Sky Raiders flew daylight sorties against NVA positions in the surrounding jungle. At some point during the siege, the precise date is not documented in available records, a B-52 arc light strike was called in, dropping more than 300 bombs, a mix of 500-pound and 750-pound ordnance, into the jungle surrounding the firebase. The B-52 strike shook the hill. The Montagnard fighters, who had never experienced a B-52 arc light at close range, believed the base itself was being bombed. Albrecht spent time after the strike reassuring his men that the explosions were friendly. The strike did not stop the NVA. They pulled back, assessed, and resumed their positions. On the morning of October 30th, a coordinated NVA assault struck Kate directly. It was beaten back with artillery fire and air support. But a Bell UH-1B Iroquois gunship, serial number 63-08587, from the helicopter units providing close air support to the firebase, was shot down during the engagement. All 4 American crewmen were killed. By October 31st, 2 of Kate's 3 artillery pieces had been destroyed. The 105 millimeter howitzer was gone. One of the 155 millimeter howitzers was out of action. First Lieutenant Ronald A. Ross of the 5th Battalion, 22nd Artillery, was killed by a B-40 rocket. The artillerymen who remained took up rifles and fought from the bunker line as infantry. They were now holding wire, not shooting guns. Albrecht radioed the ARVN commander in the area and requested reinforcement. The answer was no. He contacted Special Forces Operations. He explained the situation. He explained that Kate could no longer function as an artillery firebase, that 2 guns were destroyed, that his casualties were mounting, that resupply helicopters were being driven off by anti-aircraft fire, that the NVA showed no sign of disengaging. The response from Special Forces commanders was unambiguous. Get your men out of Kate any way you can. No American relief force was coming. The Vietnamization policy that was supposed to transfer responsibility to the ARVN had, in this instance, transferred it to no one. Kate had been written off. On the morning of November 1st, NVA artillery found its final 0 on the firebase. The rounds came in without pause. No position on the hill was safe. Albrecht described it later as no longer a functioning firebase, just an impact area where men were still alive. Helicopter support ended. The pilots who had been flying resupply and medevac under fire for days could no longer get close. The anti-aircraft coverage around the firebase was too dense. Albrecht and Piarelli sat down and drew up an escape plan. They had one option: move on foot, at night, through jungle occupied by the same NVA regiment that had been trying to kill them for 5 days. The plan was to lead approximately 150 men, the surviving Americans, the Montagnard fighters, and the walking wounded, down off the hilltop, through a gap in the wood line, and across approximately 3 miles of enemy-held terrain to a link-up point where a Special Forces Mike Force detachment, 2 companies of American Special Forces and Montagnard fighters was waiting in a concealed position. Before they left, they destroyed everything useful. The gun tubes were spiked. The remaining ammunition was demolished. Code books, radio frequencies, maps, intelligence records, anything the NVA could use was burned or smashed. The tribal elders among the Montagnard fighters made the decision, according to documented accounts, to leave their dead on the hill. The living could not carry them through what was coming. Albrecht was operating on 5 days without meaningful sleep. His arm wound had not been treated. He later described his state of mind in the hours before the breakout as close to acceptance. He expected to die. He believed he was leading dead men into the jungle. He gave the order anyway. At approximately 10 p.m. on November 1st, the column moved out. The NVA lit the sky with illumination flares within minutes. They knew. The escape route ran north down the slope of the hill, through a narrow gap in the wood line, and up the side of a ridge line the men had designated Ambush Hill during the siege. The NVA had placed forces directly across that route. A CIDG soldier who knew the terrain recognized the ambush setup before the column walked into it. The lead elements deviated. The column split. Approximately half the Montagnards and 1 artilleryman went in a separate direction and eventually reached the Special Forces camp at Buprang on their own. The main body followed Albrecht through the deviation. For the next 5 hours, Albrecht moved through jungle where NVA troops were, by his own account, everywhere. He could not know which shadows were enemy soldiers and which were trees. He could not use a light. He could not radio ahead without giving away his position. He navigated by terrain, memory, and compass, moving a column of exhausted, wounded men in silence through the dark. 3 times he crossed an open field to account for his men. 3 times he walked back into the open ground with NVA forces in the surrounding jungle. Each time he returned, he brought another group through. At 3 a.m. on November 2nd, Sergeant First Class Lowell Stevens, the Mike Force ground commander, grabbed Albrecht's arm in the dark and told him to get his remaining troops moving. They had to evacuate the link-up position immediately. The column had covered 2.5 miles in 5 hours. They then moved another 8 hours through jungle to reach the Special Forces camp at Buprang. 1 man did not make it. Private First Class Michael Norton of West Virginia disappeared in the jungle during the breakout. He was listed as missing in action. His body was never recovered. On November 2nd, Air Force aircraft bombed the remains of Firebase Kate to deny the NVA anything that had been left behind. The base was abandoned. The 5-day siege produced these numbers. 15 of 27 American artillerymen were wounded during the siege. 1 American artilleryman, First Lieutenant Ronald A. Ross, was killed. 4 helicopter crewmen were killed, when their gunship was shot down on October 30th. One soldier, Private First Class Michael Norton, was missing in action and presumed dead. Approximately one-third of the 156 Montagnard fighters were killed or wounded over the course of the siege. The Firebase was never overrun. Every defender who reached Bu Prang had walked off the hill alive. The broader NVA operation, the elimination of the Firebase network, followed by a drive on Ban Me Thuot, was disrupted for years. Ban Me Thuot would not fall until March 1975, in the opening phase of the NVA's final offensive, the one that ended the war. The corridor the 66th Regiment had attempted to open in October 1969 remained contested until the last year of the conflict. Albrecht was awarded 3 Silver Stars for his actions at Firebase Kate, one for each day he continued to command after being wounded and offered evacuation. He received 3 Purple Hearts and 5 Bronze Stars, 3 of them with the Valor device. Veterans who survived the siege later stated that the 3 Silver Stars represented a compromise. What Albrecht had done at Kate, in the view of his men and of congressional staff who later reviewed the record, was the standard for the Medal of Honor. The nomination was never submitted. The reason involves a detail that says as much about 1969 as anything else. The commanding general of the 2nd Corps Tactical Zone in Ban Me Thuot had arranged an impact award ceremony for Albrecht immediately after the escape. He dispatched a helicopter to Bu Prang to bring Albrecht to the ceremony, despite high winds that had grounded all other helicopter traffic. That helicopter crashed. No one was killed, but Albrecht was returned to his unit without the ceremony, without the paperwork, and without a record of the general's intention. The impact award was never presented. The formal nomination process never started. By the time veterans and congressional staff attempted to reconstruct the record decades later, 165 pages of eyewitness statements, after-action reports, maps, photos, and recorded radio transmissions, the window for formal consideration had closed. A congressional aide who reviewed the documentation reportedly told the advocate building the case, "What Albrecht did at Kate is the kind of thing men get recommended for the Medal of Honor. He received 3 Silver Stars instead. The battle received no press coverage at the time. The siege ran from October 27th to November 1st, 1969, a period when American public attention had already moved away from the operational details of the war and toward the political debate surrounding it. Vietnamization meant, among other things, that stories about small American outposts being abandoned by policy were not the stories anyone in Washington wanted told. Firebase Kate has reverted to jungle. The coordinates on maps from 1969 resolve today to triple canopy forest along the Cambodian border in what is now Giak Nong province. There is no marker. There is no monument. The guns are gone. The bunkers are gone. The volleyball net, the one that was still up when Albrecht walked the perimeter on October 28th, is gone. William Albrecht spent 25 years after Vietnam as a United States Secret Service agent. He guarded 5 American presidents. He rarely spoke about Kate. He was not sure, he said later, that he had the right to tell a story that belonged to so many other men. In 2016, he published his account of the siege. He called it Abandoned in Hell, Private First Class. Michael Robert Norton of West Virginia has a name on Panel 16W, line 121 of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. His body was never recovered. He is classified as missing in action. The night march Albrecht led on November 1st, 1969, 150 men, no infantry training, through enemy-held jungle in silence, 5 hours, 2.5 miles, has never been replicated. Military historians have described it as a feat that was not duplicated during the Vietnam War. He was 21 years old. It was his first command. The base was his first week.